Välkommen till Stolpes Stories, en podcast om litteratur och humaniora från Bokförlaget Stolpe. Vår värd för programmet heter Svante Tirén.
Grundprinciperna för klassisk arkitektur har varit i stort sett oförändrade ända sedan antiken. Och trots att de övergavs i samband med modernismens intåg på 1900-talet så dog de aldrig ut helt och hållet. Idag så finns ett växande intresse för klassisk arkitektur och det här med att kunna rita kolonner och former hämtade ur de antika templens värld. En av de som arbetar med det här det är den brittiske arkitekten Quinlan Terry. Han har ägnat hela sin karriär åt att rita hus i klassisk stil och nu har han samlat sin kunskap i en ny bok. Den heter The Layman's Guide to Classical Architecture och är en handbok för nybörjare som vill lära känna de här klassiska formerna. Vi träffade honom på Downing College i Cambridge i England där han berättade om arbetet med boken men också sin egen väg in i den klassiska arkitekturen med hjälp av läraren Raymond Erith. So Mr. Terry, could you please start by telling us why you wanted to write this book?
Well, I think a number of reasons, really. A lot of people like classical architecture, but they don't know how to look at it. And I thought if any of the laymen could understand what they're looking at, then they would be more active in commissioning architects and begin to get more of a revival in classicism. I mean, it's rather like, I think I said in my introduction that if you're interested in wildflowers, you have to learn a lot of new words, you have to understand that there are different families, and it's quite hard work to learn these new words that you don't use in any other context. And you have to use the words because there's no other word than anther or filament or petal or sepal. And if you don't use the right word, you don't know what part of the plant you're looking at. And if you're talking about the rose family or the ranunculaceae, which is the buttercup family, they're completely different in all sorts of ways. Once you begin to understand that, you begin to get a real workable interest in wildflowers. And it's just the same with any other subject, and architecture is one of them. So that was one reason. Another reason was that I was fortunate very early in my career, having seen through modernism, but not really knowing who to do it with, was introduced to Raymond Erith. And I worked with him for 11 years, and he taught me virtually everything I knew. And that experience was important, and I thought it needed to be recorded, because he not only taught me how to understand the orders, which is fairly straightforward, but he also taught me how to build properly. And in a way, that has been my great advantage, I think, because I worked alongside him for 11 years in this small office, and he felt passionately about classical architecture, and he was, the one person who really knew, but he didn't have many opportunities.
Mm. I know you said you spent 7 years studying architecture at architecture school,
yes.
But you learned virtually nothing.
Nothing. I think my eyes were opened by one or two of us who there were three scholars. I was the lowest scholar, but there was another one called Andrew Anderson, who was very gifted, and Malcolm Higgs, and the three of us used to bicycle round the east end of London and look at these Georgian squares being pulled down because they were war damaged in many ways, and instead of repairing them, they built these 12-story skyscrapers.
All the things that we regret now when we so painfully look at these photographs of how it used to look.
And, that's where the working classes of England lived, and they were used to living in these sort of houses, and they had a back garden, and they had vegetables and that sort of thing. And all of those people have been moved into these 12-story buildings, and we thought at the time something must be seriously wrong. So, in a sense, our eyes were beginning to open, but no one was telling us how to do it.
And it hasn't been easy, hasn't it? Because there's been a lot of resistance to all of this over the years.
Tremendous resistance. I mean, when I worked with Raymond Erith, I remember there was a very good client who rich man who wanted to give the village a little almshouse for 12 people. And it was a lovely design. We put it in for planning approval, and it was refused. And the grounds of the refusal was it's not in line with modern thinking.
Right.
So there was a sort of doctrinaire attitude that it was wrong for anyone to do
almost.
anything immoral. I mean, I think, we discovered penicillin and that cures people. So we've now discovered steel and glass and concrete and how you can use it. And you've got to use it. And to think that you shut your mind to that and do something which is characteristic of the world 100, 200 years ago is morally wrong.
And I understand that's an important principle in all your work, really. It's not only a discussion about aesthetics, it's a discussion about values, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Most people associate the term classical architecture with 3 and, well, sometimes 5 order of columns. But how do you define classical architecture?
Well, I think in a way they're right to do so, because any nation looking around at what's been done by previous nations, particularly what was done by the Romans, where the Romans get their ideas from, they got it from Greece. Wherever the Greeks got it from, whether they got it from Egypt or from Israel or wherever, they see a way of building, particularly in Greece and in Italy, which are outstanding buildings. And if you are in the position where you want to build a major building of importance, you inevitably look to the great people who've done them before. And then you become interested in the orders and you reuse them. You may not reuse them quite as the original architects used them, and there may be all sorts of reasons why the style changes as it did between Greece and Rome, but the ingredients are there and reinterpreted by people at different times. And that is what classical architecture really is.
And I suppose once you know the orders, that is also the world that is opening up, is the fact that there is such a long history and it touches so many cultures, so many contexts, right?
Yes.
Historically, we have the famous treatises, of course, by Vitruvius, by Alberti, Palladio, Vignola, and so on. But if we compare written knowledge compared to the more empirical, practical-based knowledge, how do you think about these two? Most people only get to the first.
I'm not quite sure why Palladio and Vignola wrote their books. I think partly because they had learnt an awful lot which they wanted to record. That's partly why I've done my book. I think Palladio did it when he was reasonably young. I mean, he was a stonemason, and maybe he felt that, this might lead to other interesting work. It's certainly an amazingly complete work. I mean, it's amazing how much he's got into that book.
And still fairly possible to read for an average reader today,
Readable, no? And his records of the buildings he measured in Rome. I mean, I think there's 99 woodcuts of what he saw and drew and did. So he must have been an amazingly gifted writer as well as practicer. His practice is just amazing.
One very important difference between this book and the historic treatises is, of course, that here we see them from different angles. We meet the sort of human eye perspective rather than just elevations and so on. And could you talk a little bit about this? Because it's your drawings throughout the book mostly. And why did nobody do this before, showing the buildings from more complex angles and how the eyes meet them?
I haven't thought about that. I'd always sketched buildings ever since I met Raymond Erith, and went to Italy nearly every year and drew what I liked the look of. And when I was a Rome scholar, I measured a lot of buildings I liked the look of just for record and put them into sketchbooks. So this was, it was an enjoyable pastime to go and look at a building and draw what you see. And the other thing is that a lot of books will give you, in fact, all the books, Palladio and Vignola, are actually plans and sections and elevations. Whereas the layman doesn't understand a plan or a section, really can't apply them. Only an architect or a builder can. And in fact, what matters is seeing it in 3 dimensions as you look at it. You're looking up at into a mould, into a cornice, And also you're seeing how the shadows enhance the shape. And there's nothing, I think, more direct than pencil and paper and a sketchbook I did it just because I enjoyed doing it and because I liked to record things that I'd seen with the possible use of being able to use them on some building.
And that, I suppose, is what most successful classicists has always done, drawing.
Yes.
Sketching, looking.
Sketching. You've got to be able to sketch. And you've got to enjoy sketching.
Now, the first part of the book focuses on the 3 or 5 orders, depending on how we describe it. But you have also included Romanesque, Gothic, Indian, and later architectural revivals among the topics here. Why do you include these in a book on classical architecture?
Well, really, because they have the same ingredients. You look at the Gothic column, it's a column. It has a base, it has a capital. The capital generally has leaves. So it's some form of Corinthian. And most of the ones you describe, Gothic, Romanesque, were practiced by fairly uneducated people who were builders, and they wanted to put up a building, and they would have seen classical buildings. So it wouldn't surprise them that what they want to build has columns and capitals and bases. And I think that they weren't very scholarly to start with, but they learned to build well with stone, and they weren't necessarily thinking they must copy exactly what they've seen of the Greeks or the Romans. But, we see it sort of looking back through Gothic, but the Goths or the Normans and those people, they were just putting up simple buildings which they thought were, to some extent, similar to what they'd seen elsewhere.
They are presented as polar opposites, the Gothic and the classical.
Well,
but
afterwards,
actually,
you get Pugin in the 19th century saying that classic is pagan and Gothic is Christian, which is mad because there's hardly a Gothic building in Rome. And, so all the buildings in Rome are not Christian, they're pagan by his definition. You get all that, but that's what people said in the 19th century. But previously, Romanesque, you look at, I sketched it in my book, Indian buildings, and they have, if you analyze them, they have columns and they have capitals and they have arches. And the capital uses the circular base and turns it into a square in order to take a beam. So that interspace, which is doing nothing more than a classical capital would do, is done in a slightly different way, which to my mind means it's all part of the classical tradition. It's not strictly classical in our terms, but it's an inspired way of using the elements.
So the more you learn about classical architecture, the more you also learn how everything is connected, how there are share universal traits and principles in different cultures.
And that's why I think it's important to include them, because otherwise you're left with Pugin's argument that sort of, Gothic is good and classic is bad, which is pointless because they're all part of the same tradition.
That's another thing. There has always been strong opinions on classical architecture, hasn't there, in many directions? And I suppose some of them scare away some people because you feel the need that you have to have a sharp opinion yourself. How do you find your own opinion, your own way into classical architecture?
Well, I'm fairly relaxed about it. That's really why I've included so much about Gothic and Romanesque, because if someone sees classical in slightly different terms, good luck to him. I don't think we're saying everything has got to be, you mustn't use the Doric order, which is 8.5 diameters high, when Palladio said it should be 8. It's free, and it all really comes back to building well. And the reason a column is a certain number of diameters high is partly history, partly your experience, but also what is the right way to support a load when you want to erect a building which you can get into, and a building that looks appropriate. So it's not just structural, it's what would be appropriate on that particular position.
Once the basic principles are there is room for a lot of interpretation, right?
Yes.
Many different styles. Now, you have seen a very special, I think, journey here from when you're starting out, when there were almost nobody doing this, to now when there is a big interest in classical architecture. There are schools of classical architecture. We're sitting now in a new founded school for classical architecture. What do you think of the future? I mean, now there's certainly an interest, but how will this progress, do you think?
Well, I think that the danger is for someone who's been doing it all my life to see someone who's starting up and say, well, it's a pity he doesn't do it better. I don't think that really matters. You're not going to do something you've never done before well if it's your first building. But, well, I think your question really is it going to catch on? And I tend to think that it will. I mean, I think that... the interesting thing is I sometimes think that architecture, modern architecture as it is today, is getting a little bit like the Church of England. You know, there are good churches up and down the country, but the bishops don't seem to honour them or encourage them or say anything good about them. They just seem to think that they talk about anything but the facts. And the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, is a bit like that. Architects are beginning to show interest in classical architecture. There's not a word about it in the RIBA journal. In fact, more and more, they're trying to sort of rave about the excitements of modern architecture and encourage people to think in the way that the people who taught us 40 years ago were trying to persuade us that it's inevitable that modern architecture is the only way to do things. So I think we're not getting any encouragement from the powers that be and the people at the top. But there are more and more classical architects practicing, and they're not, some of them are doing quite good work, and people are beginning to commission them, not just private clients, but public clients as well. And I think that if it's properly handled, there could be a return to what I would say common sense. It's not just common sense in what you're looking at, but it's common sense in building, because a traditional building will last hundreds of years. My office was built in Middle Ages, timber building in a village, and I've worked there all my life. And apart from repairing the slates and occasionally putting a coat of paint on things, it'll be there for another 100, 200 years. You can't say that about modern buildings. It's made of steel and concrete and glass, and it's built for a lifetime. And in fact, in America now, and I think even in China, they're saying that the buildings are built for a useful life of 40 years.
So in that sense, classical architecture is more in alignment with cyclical thinking and sustainability even.
Yes. Well, I mean, if you put up what's happening at the moment in London, they're putting up 20-storey, 30-storey buildings, and they last 40 years, and they have to be demolished, quite apart from the fact that they all depend on air conditioning, and you can't even open a window to breathe, so and heating, excessive heating. But if you're having to rebuild a city every 50 years, what is it doing to the environment? Whereas if you build traditional building, you've got something which your grandchildren and great-grandchildren after that can continue to use. I mean, it may need a little bit of repair and alteration, but I mean, all these buildings at Downing, which are quite recent in classical terms, 100, 200 years old, and not really needing vast amounts spent on them.
Looking at how the discussion is now, what do you find are the biggest misconceptions about classical architecture? That it's perhaps overly complicated or not possible for anyone to be interested in or such things?
I think that the schools of architecture have done a tremendous amount of damage. I mean, historically, you didn't go to a school of architecture, you worked with someone, like I worked with Layman, so you were apprenticed. Lutyens, I think, didn't go work for anyone. He worked with other architects. And if you work in an architect's office, you see the top man doing things, drawing, designing, and particularly if he's like Raymond Irith, who would talk about what he did and why he did it, you learn. But if you're at a school of architecture, you're being taught by a whole lot of people who've never built anything. So they don't really know how to do it. They probably can't draw. All they can do is talk. And that is what I found when we were at the Architecture Association.
So it's too theoretical, and in that sense, again, classical architecture is more direct in the fact that you do need to hold a pencil in your hand to grasp it, no?
Indeed. Yes.
If you look at the classical architecture that is built now, it seems that there are some dominating trades here. For instance, sort of Georgian-inspired building seems to be quite popular. Why do you think we have not seen more, let's say, wild, Baroque or Mannerist experiments within sort of contemporary classical architecture?
Well, I think it takes some time for Baroque to catch on. I mean, Michelangelo was quite late on. You know, it's nearly 100 years after Bramante, and Bramante was not Baroque. And every sort of human feeling finds its way into the way it's handled. And Michelangelo was a restless, difficult person who felt very strongly about all sorts of things, and he knew the rules, and he liked to break the rules, and he could break the rules with quite sort of interesting effects, which is what he did. And if you like it, that's fine. And then there's gentler forms of Baroque. But I think it isn't the first thing. It's not where you start. I think you start with more simple Palladian proportions. And then after you've been doing that for 40 years, you think, well, do we have to have a straight cornice? Can we not make it have a serpentine front and a curvature? And I think this went through the whole design of the Corinthian capital and the Ionic, particularly the Ionic. I mean, Michelangelo's Ionic and Vignola's representation of them show how he uses the bolster on the end and twists the position of the volutes to make it more interesting.
If I understand you correctly, we are now really sort of rebuilding the basics, right? And if we get more time to do that, perhaps more experimental things will come out of it eventually.
Yes. I mean, I've been doing it all my life, and I've done a number of, I think you would call, I mean, the Corinthian Villa is a Baroque building. It has a serpentine front, which, of course, is, you know, a Baroque element. It's fascinating that, in a way, Palladio, I think, was one of the masters, but he didn't have serpentine fronts, he didn't have broken pediments, quite a few things that you associate with Michelangelo you wouldn't see in Palladio. I think, you know, people's character can show in different ways. And in my book there's a sketch of a building in Poland which is very Baroque, and it was the inspiration for a door case on a plainer house, which I did in Sussex. So I think as people get used to doing it, and after they've been doing it for 30, 40, 50 years, inevitably they think of other ways. Not necessarily, they may not, it depends on their personality, they may be rather puritanistic, but it's all part of the way that classical architecture reflects the human personality.
It's an organic process where, I mean, most classicists, I suppose, break the rules in some way or another, right? But it depends very much on the mood and also how much training you have and so on.
And you say they break the rules. The rules are there not necessarily to be broken, but I mean, it isn't breaking the rules, because why shouldn't you have a serpentine pediment?
It's the other way around. They actually open up for you to
yes,
do those things. Sometimes you see a building, quite an ordinary building, and they just glue some columns to it.
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily make it classical, does it?
Well, I think if it was as bad as that, it would be some builder who was asked, I've got a client who wants a classical building, so I better have some classical columns. And he sticks a classical column on what is effectively a very ordinary, probably modern building. And I wouldn't find it easy to answer that.
It's always been a disputed term, of course, but maybe that's part of the tradition too, the fact that once we know the orders, there is a new foundation to have informed discussions on this, and new decisions.
Yes. I mean, what I think is, maybe not quite answering your question, but what is to me so amazing about the classical tradition is that any building, any classical building that you look at, if you know, as you know, you and I have had experience of looking at buildings, you can tell at a glance, usually, when it was built and where it was built, regardless of who was the architect. You can look at something and say that looks late Georgian, or it looks earlier Georgian, or it looks French, or it's Germanic, or even it's American. There's a slight difference again. And probably the same with Sweden and anywhere else. You know, the more you know about. So, you know, in the stone and the timber and the detail, however it's handled by the architect without them fully realizing it, is a statement which people 100, 200 years later can look at it and say, that's early Georgian, or that's obviously in France, or, you know, it comes from Germany or somewhere like that.
That's right. And I know in your buildings, you have not tried to make them look as they were built historically. They do bear the sign of our time, no?
I wouldn't know that because I'm of our time. Whereas in 100 years' time, they would say that's 21st century classical, you know, English, or it's making a statement against something else. You know, there's something in it. I mean, in the same way that, you know, Pennsylvania Railway Station in the US, McKim, Mead and White, they wanted to build a railway station. How do you build a big railway station? And they go and look at these buildings in Rome, and they copy them. I mean, complete with coffering and everything else, bars of Caracalla. And they build a building. And it says something about Rome, but it's also saying a lot about America.
That's also an interesting thing about classicism, how many cultures and time periods claiming that as their sort of architecture, you know.
Yeah.
It can be filled with so much character, but it's hard to touch on because, again, the principles are more or less the same, but there is something more to it.
And there's something of the age and the country that goes into the mix that the architect doesn't realize. You're handling something and you find when you've died and, you know, 100 years later, people said, you know, he was doing something. And I don't think the architect is fully aware of how he is doing something in an English or an 18th century or 19th century way, which you don't get with modern architecture. It's just a rejection of that whole world, whereas classical architecture is the natural way to build.
And more perhaps understanding of the fact that nothing is more timeless than it claims. I mean, it's always bears its own time, the mark of it.
You can't help it.
No. Now, this book, of course, is for laymen, as you say. But in terms of viewership and readership and so on, who do you hope will read this book and use it?
Well, I think I say it's a textbook. I mean, it says it's for the layman. I think the layman has to be quite serious about it, like I would someone who's trying to do wildflowers. I think it would be helpful if architects read it because I think that it would help them understand what we're talking about. It isn't first and foremost a book for students because I think, you know, once the layman knows what's going on, he will say to his architect, look, I want a Doric order, or I want a particular, you know, I want certain things I like or I don't like. I don't like broken pediments. I don't like Baroque. Or I do like them. And you can have quite a fruitful conversation with an intelligent layman who's got the means to employ architects, and the architect ought to be able to understand what he wants. It's rather assuming that the people who read it will. But I think, you know, well, you've got to start somewhere.
And of course, you don't only need architects knowing this, the public needs to know this, and people commissioning buildings, of course, needs to know this.
Yes, and this is why it's for laymen first.
And we'll see how classical architecture will develop in the future.
Yes.
But thank you again so much for joining us, and congratulations to the book.
Well, thank you.
Tack för att du har lyssnat på Stolpes Stories. Missa inte att du som lyssnar har 20% rabatt på Bokförlaget Stolpes titlar hos Bokus.se. Aktivera rabatten genom att ange koden STOLPE20. Och för att lyssna på fler avsnitt, följ oss där poddar finns och på sociala medier.